He chose business over her, but 4 years later, the Millionaire CEO froze when he saw her, with 2 sons who had his eyes. Alexander Morgan stood in his office high above the city, the glass walls around him framing a skyline bathed in the orange haze of late afternoon. The world below pulsed with motion, horns blaring, lights flickering on one by one, streets alive with 1,000 untold stories, but up here everything felt still, heavy, almost airless. Behind him, the low hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, until Emily's voice broke through. She was seated in the leather chair across from his desk, her posture tense, her brown eyes locked on him with a mixture of frustration and something softer that she was struggling to hold on to. Her hair, the color of chestnuts, caught the fading light from the window, but there was no warmth in her gaze now. She told him she couldn't keep standing on the sidelines while he drowned himself in deals, meetings, and endless travel. She wanted more than the leftover hours he gave her when the work was done, more than a relationship built in the spaces between phone calls and flights. He listened, or at least he made himself stand there as her words filled the room, but his mind was already working through the final details of the deal waiting for his signature. This was the largest acquisition his company had ever attempted, the kind of move that would cement his place in the industry for decades. Investors were circling, competitors were watching, and everything hinged on his full attention right now. Her timing, he thought, couldn't have been worse. When she reached for his hand, trying to pull him back into the conversation, he hesitated for only a heartbeat before stepping away, as though her touch might tether him to something he wasn't ready to commit to. Emily's voice trembled then, not with weakness, but with the strain of holding herself together. She told him she loved him, but she couldn't compete with the empire he was building. She needed someone who would choose her without hesitation. The truth was, Alexander knew exactly what she was asking for, and part of him wanted to give it. But another part, the part shaped by years of ambition and the belief that love could wait until everything else was secure, was louder. In his mind, there would always be time later, after the next contract, the next victory, the next climb to a higher floor. When he finally spoke, his words were careful but empty of the reassurance she needed. He told her this deal was everything, that he couldn't afford to lose it, and that she had to understand. Her expression shifted in that moment, something in her going still, as though she had just received confirmation of a fear she'd been carrying for months. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She only stood, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and said goodbye in a voice so quiet he almost missed it. The click of the door behind her was soft, but it echoed in the vast space like a closing vault. Alexander turned back to the window, the city stretching endlessly before him, and told himself he had done the right thing. There would be time for her later, once he had secured the future he was fighting for. But even as the lights of the city brightened against the deepening sky, a part of him felt the shift, as if something irreplaceable had just slipped away, and he had been too focused on the numbers to notice until it was gone. For years can pass in the blink of an eye when you fill them with noise, and Alexander Morgan had made sure his life was never silent. The years after Emily's departure were a blur of business trips, champagne toasts, and conference rooms in cities that all began to look the same. He built deal upon deal, stacking success like bricks in a tower so tall he could no longer see the ground he'd started from. On paper, he was unstoppable, his company's value doubled, his name appeared in glossy magazines, and his face was recognized at every high-profile event. But when the day's applause faded and the penthouse doors closed behind him, the silence that filled the space was deafening. The rooms were vast, polished, and cold, a monument to ambition with no warmth to soften it. He told himself this was the life he had chosen, the life he had sacrificed for, but there were nights when the pretense cracked. Sometimes, after a particularly long day, he would find himself staring into the glass of whiskey in his hand, wondering what she was doing at that exact moment. He never allowed himself to dig too deeply into those thoughts. It was easier to believe she had moved on, perhaps found someone else who could give her the time and devotion he couldn't. What he didn't know, and perhaps part of him never dared to imagine, was that only months after he had walked away, Emily had discovered she was pregnant. She left the city without looking back, settling in a quiet town hours away, where the noise of Alexander's world could not reach her. There, in a modest house at the edge of a tree-lined street, she raised twin boys with dark hair and vivid blue eyes that mirrored their father's so perfectly it sometimes made her chest ache. She built a life for them from scratch, balancing part-time jobs with endless late nights, her world revolving around two small beings who had her smile and his gaze. The boys grew quickly, their personalities taking shape, one bold and fearless, the other thoughtful and observant, but both carrying that same spark in their eyes. They asked about their father once in a while, questions Emily always answered carefully, never lying but never giving them the full truth. She told herself it was better that way, better to protect them from the kind of disappointment she had endured. She didn't want their image of him to be shaped by the memory of a man who had chosen boardrooms over a family he hadn't even known he had. Meanwhile, Alexander's life continued on its polished, lonely track. He surrounded himself with colleagues, admirers, and acquaintances, yet no one ever truly crossed the invisible wall he kept between himself and the rest of the world. He didn't realize how much of himself he had walled off until small, unexpected moments caught him off guard, seeing a father lift his son onto his shoulders in a park, or overhearing a child's laughter drift in from the street. They were fleeting glimpses into a life he had told himself wasn't his to live, and each one left a faint mark he couldn't entirely ignore. By the time the fourth year came to a close, Alexander had nearly perfected the art of keeping that part of himself buried. He believed Emily was nothing more than a ghost from his past, a chapter he had chosen to close. But the truth was waiting for him just beyond the horizon, and it would arrive not with a gentle tap, but with a collision so sharp it would make him realize how much those missing years had truly cost. The night of the charity auction began like any other networking event in Alexander Morgan's carefully curated life. The grand ballroom of the Park Regency Hotel was a masterpiece of polished marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and the low murmur of conversations wrapped in expensive perfume and the faint aroma of champagne. The event was meant to benefit children's medical programs, a cause his company's public relations team insisted he support for the optics, though he told himself it was also a way to balance the ruthless image his business dealings often carried. He had attended countless such evenings, where the real negotiations took place not in boardrooms but over hors d'oeuvres and handshakes under soft golden light. He arrived dressed in a charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted, prepared to glide through another night of polite conversations and subtle deals. The first hour passed without incident. He exchanged pleasantries with donors, posed for photographs with city officials, and made small talk with the auctioneer about the evening's top items. He was already thinking about how early he could leave without offending anyone when his gaze drifted toward the far end of the ballroom. It was a space set up for families, away from the main crowd, with colorful decorations, small tables, and an area where volunteers were entertaining children while their parents mingled. That was when he saw her. Emily. She was standing near a table stacked with art supplies, bending down to help a child with a set of markers. Her hair was slightly longer than he remembered, still that rich brown that caught the light, and she wore a simple navy dress that made her look both effortlessly elegant and completely out of place among the jeweled gowns and tailored tuxedos. Even from across the room, he recognized the way she moved, the quiet grace in her gestures, the calm focus she gave to the child in front of her. For a moment, the chatter and clinking glasses faded into a dull hum, and he stood there unable to breathe. Before he could decide whether to approach her, two boys ran into view, their laughter slicing through the background noise like a clear bell. They were perhaps 3 or 4 years old, dressed in matching white shirts and navy trousers, their small faces lit up with excitement as they called out to her. And then Alexander saw it, their hair, a dark shade so familiar it made his chest tighten, and their eyes, a striking blue that mirrored his own so perfectly it felt like looking into a reflection. The realization hit him with such force that he forgot to move. His mind scrambled for explanations, each one collapsing under the weight of the obvious truth. He watched as Emily turned to greet the boys, crouching down so they could wrap their arms around her neck. She smiled at them, a real, unguarded smile that he hadn't seen in years, and for a brief second he saw a fragment of the life he might have had, one not filled with glass towers and empty penthouses, but with messy mornings and the laughter of children who shared his gaze. One of the boys noticed him first. He paused mid-sentence, his blue eyes locking onto Alexander's across the room with an intensity that seemed far too knowing for his age. The other boy followed his brother's gaze, and within moments both of them were staring openly at him. They didn't look away. Instead, they tilted their heads almost in unison, as if silently asking a question they didn't have the words for. Emily turned then, following their gaze. When her eyes met his, the room seemed to constrict around them. She froze, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Her expression wasn't one of shock so much as a tightening, a bracing for impact. He felt the weight of all the years between them pressed down, years he had thought were buried but now stood embodied in the small forms of two boys holding her hands. He took a step forward without realizing it, but Emily reacted immediately, placing a hand gently on each of the boys' shoulders and guiding them toward the children's area. She didn't break eye contact, but her message was clear: not here, not now. Alexander stopped, the noise of the auction seeping back into his awareness, though it felt far away, irrelevant. All that mattered was that in the span of a few seconds, the carefully constructed order of his life had been upended. He now knew the truth, and he also knew there was no version of himself that could walk away from this moment and remain unchanged. He found her later in a quiet corridor outside the main ballroom, the muffled sounds of the auction filtering through the closed doors behind him. She was standing near a tall window that looked out over the city, her posture straight but her shoulders tense, as if she had been bracing for him to come. The soft glow from the hallway sconces outlined her face, highlighting the subtle changes in her features, a faint crease near her brow, a touch more gravity in her eyes. She didn't look surprised to see him, only wary, as though she had already rehearsed this conversation in her mind and wasn't eager to have it. He walked toward her slowly, the polished floor amplifying each step, and for the first time in years, Alexander Morgan felt uncertain about his own voice. When he finally spoke, it wasn't the carefully controlled tone he used in boardrooms. He asked if the boys were his, though he already knew the answer. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded once, her eyes never leaving his. There was no dramatic reveal, no gasp or denial, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. She told him she had found out she was pregnant only weeks after he left, and that she hadn't tried to contact him. Not because she wanted to punish him, but because she knew the life he was chasing had no room for them. She said she had made peace with raising the children alone, building a home for them in a place far removed from the noise and demands of his world. Her words carried no overt anger, but there was an undercurrent of something sharper, something that made him feel as if he were standing trial. She described nights sitting in the dark when the boys were sick and she had no one to turn to, mornings when she worked before dawn so she could be back in time to walk them to preschool, moments of pure exhaustion that she pushed through because there was no other choice. She spoke of the joy too, their first words, their first steps, the way they laughed together, but even as she recounted those moments, he felt the weight of them as losses he could never reclaim. Alexander wanted to explain, to tell her that he hadn't known, that if he had received even one message from her, everything might have been different. But when he said as much, her eyes narrowed slightly, and she told him she had written to him. Not once, but many times. Letters, emails, even messages through mutual acquaintances. At first, she thought he was ignoring her, too focused on his career to respond. Later, she realized the messages had likely been intercepted. She had always suspected that someone close to him, perhaps in his inner circle, had decided she was a distraction he didn't need. Hearing it laid out like that sent a cold ripple down his spine. He could think of at least one person from those years who had been possessive of his schedule and protective to the point of control. The realization left him reeling, but Emily didn't soften. She told him that the boys knew of him only in the most general sense, that she had been careful not to shape their opinion too strongly one way or another. They knew their father's name, but not his face, not the sound of his voice. She said she didn't want to plant expectations that might go unfulfilled. Her words landed with the quiet finality of a gavel striking wood, and he found himself at a loss for how to counter them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was filled with everything unsaid, the years gone, the choices made, the blame shared in unequal measures. He could see in her expression that she wasn't looking for apologies or grand declarations. If he wanted a place in his sons' lives, he would have to prove himself in ways that went beyond words. And standing there, under the pale light of the corridor, Alexander understood that this was not a negotiation he could win with charm or resources. This was about trust, and trust was something he had walked away from once before. Now, if he wanted it back, he would have to earn it one day at a time. She glanced toward the ballroom doors, where the sound of applause signaled the end of another auction item, then back at him. Without a goodbye, she stepped past him and returned to the event, leaving him alone in the hallway. He watched her go, the hem of her dress disappearing into the crowd, and felt the sharp sting of knowing that for the first time in years, he wanted something he couldn't simply take. He wanted his family, and for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand just how much it would cost to truly have them. In the days following their conversation in the corridor, Alexander found himself haunted by every word Emily had said. Her voice, calm yet edged with the weight of unspoken years, followed him through board meetings and echoed in the quiet of his penthouse at night. He couldn't shake the image of his sons, looking up at him with eyes that mirrored his own, eyes that held a question he wasn't sure he deserved to answer. For years, he had convinced himself that the life he'd chosen was the only path worth walking, but now, that path felt like it had been built on sand. Every deal he closed, every handshake he accepted, seemed hollow compared to the thought of being absent from their lives for another day. He began reaching out cautiously, knowing that a single misstep could close the door Emily had only barely cracked open. At first it was small gestures, books for the boys he thought they might like, sent without fanfare, a contribution to their preschool's art program, made anonymously, a quiet offer to help with anything they might need. Emily acknowledged his efforts with polite but guarded responses, never encouraging him too much, never letting him believe that his presence had been fully accepted. It was a slow, measured process, and though it frustrated him, he understood. Trust was not a gift she would give freely a second time. The first time he saw the boys outside the auction was in a park near Emily's home. She had agreed to meet for an hour, nothing more, and only in a public place. The boys were shy at first, clinging to her side, but curiosity got the better of them. Alexander crouched to their level, speaking to them not as a stranger trying to win their affection, but as someone genuinely interested in what they had to say. He asked about their favorite games, listened as they told him about a recent trip to the zoo, and laughed when they tried to explain the difference between a crocodile and an alligator. There was a flicker of something warm in those moments, not yet recognition, but perhaps the beginning of familiarity. Still, Emily's eyes stayed watchful. She told him plainly that the boys had lived their entire lives without him and that she would not allow anyone to step in only to disappear again. If he wanted to be their father, he would need to prove that he was there for the long term, that he was capable of showing up consistently, not just in moments of guilt or grand gestures. Alexander agreed without hesitation, but deep down, he knew this would be the hardest promise he had ever tried to keep. His world had always been built around speed, decisive action, and measurable results. This would require patience, humility, and a willingness to accept that the outcome might not be in his control. Weeks passed, and Alexander began carving time out of his schedule in ways he never had before. He started refusing late-night meetings that kept him away from the city, declining trips that would have taken him away for weeks at a time. His colleagues were surprised, some even concerned, but he didn't care. Every afternoon he spent with the boys, building towers out of blocks, reading picture books, or simply sitting on the grass while they chased each other, reinforced the sense that this was the only work that truly mattered. The more he saw them, the more he began to notice their subtle similarities to him, the tilt of their heads when they were thinking, the way one of them drummed his fingers when impatient, the spark in their eyes when they figured something out on their own. But as much as these small victories meant to him, Alexander also felt the invisible wall Emily kept in place. She was polite, even friendly at times, but her guard never fully lowered. She had built a life in his absence, and while she was beginning to allow him into it, she was not ready to give him the same place he might have had if he had never left. This awareness both humbled and unsettled him. He realized that this was not a simple matter of reclaiming what was once his, it was about earning a place in a world that had learned to function without him. Late one evening, after dropping the boys off at her home, he lingered in his car, watching the warm light spill from the living room window. He could see their silhouettes moving inside, Emily tidying up, the boys tumbling over each other on the couch, and for a moment, he felt like an intruder looking into a life that was whole without him. But instead of walking away, as he had once done, he made himself a silent promise. He would keep showing up, not because he believed it would be easy, but because this was the only fight worth losing sleep over. And if he failed this time, there would be no excuse, no redemption. It was in that quiet moment, staring at the glow of a home he wanted to be part of, that Alexander understood the full weight of Emily's question in the cafe: did he want them back out of love, or was it just guilt? He knew now that guilt had been the spark, but love, the fierce, steady kind that required staying even when it was hard, was what would keep him there. And for the first time, he was ready to let that love lead him, even if it meant dismantling the life he had built to make room for the one he had almost lost forever. It happened on an unremarkable Thursday, the kind of day that should have passed without incident. The air was clear and crisp, the first hints of winter beginning to bite, and Alexander had been in the middle of a meeting when his phone began to buzz with a string of urgent calls from an unfamiliar number. He ignored the first two, thinking they were a wrong number, but when the third call came immediately after, something in his gut twisted. He excused himself from the conference room, stepping into the hallway to answer, and the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. It was Emily, and she was barely holding herself together. Her words came in short, uneven bursts: the boys were missing. They hadn't come home from school, and no one had seen them since they left the playground. Alexander's mind snapped into focus with a clarity that felt almost unnatural. He asked her to tell him everything, every detail, every possible lead, while he was already walking toward the elevator. She said she had called the police, but they were still in the initial stages of organizing a search. He could hear the panic beneath her attempts to stay calm, and it was enough to ignite something fierce and unyielding inside him. By the time his car pulled up to her house, she was pacing on the porch, her face pale, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. She handed it to him without a word, and he scanned it quickly. The note was short and deliberate: "We have them. Do not involve the police further. You know what we want." The handwriting was sharp, almost mechanical, and at the bottom was a number, a sum that wasn't random. It was the exact figure from one of his private accounts, an amount known to almost no one. The realization that this wasn't a random abduction hit him like a blow. This was targeted, personal, and the list of people who could have orchestrated it was short. He thought back to the years before he and Emily had crossed paths again, to deals that had left bitter enemies in their wake, to people he had cut out of his life without a second thought. It didn't take long for a name to rise to the top of his mind, a man he had once trusted implicitly, someone who had been in his inner circle before betrayal forced Alexander to remove him. The timing, the precision, the knowledge of that account, it all fit too perfectly to be coincidence. Emily's voice shook as she told him she couldn't just sit and wait for the police to catch up. He assured her he wouldn't. In that moment, his entire existence narrowed down to one objective: bringing his sons back. He called in favors from contacts who owed him for past deals, people who could find information quickly and without leaving a paper trail. Within hours, they had traced the movements of an unmarked van seen near the school to a rundown warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. It wasn't enough for the police to act immediately, but it was enough for Alexander to know where he needed to be. When he told Emily he was going, she tried to stop him, insisting it was too dangerous, but he was already preparing to leave. He promised her he would bring them back and that nothing, no threat, no injury, no negotiation gone wrong, would stop him. There was a finality in his voice that made her step back, her eyes wide with fear but also with something else, the reluctant understanding that he was not going to let anyone else fight this battle for him. The drive to the warehouse was a blur, the city lights smearing across the windshield as his focus sharpened into something almost physical. Every second felt like a countdown, each block bringing him closer to whatever waited inside. He replayed every possible scenario in his mind, planning for each outcome, but the only image that truly mattered was the one of the boys running back into Emily's arms. He thought of the first time he had seen them, standing in that ballroom beside her, and how much had changed since then. Back then, they had been strangers bound only by blood. Now, they were his sons in every way that counted, and losing them was not an option. By the time he reached the outskirts of the industrial district, night had fallen, and the air was heavy with the smell of oil and rust. The warehouse sat back from the road, its windows dark, its corrugated metal walls streaked with years of weather. He parked a block away, the duffel bag containing the demanded sum resting on the passenger seat beside him. For a moment, he sat in the stillness, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his breath slow and steady. There was no room left for hesitation. He got out, slinging the bag over his shoulder, and walked toward the looming structure. Every step was deliberate, each one carrying the weight of the years he had lost and the certainty that he would not lose another day to the mistakes of his past. The closer he came, the more he felt the air change, heavier, tighter, as though the building itself knew what was about to happen. Somewhere inside, his sons were waiting, and Alexander Morgan intended to bring them home, no matter what it cost him. The warehouse swallowed him in darkness the moment he stepped through the narrow side door, the stale air thick with the smell of rust, dust, and something faintly chemical. The echo of his footsteps bounced off the walls, magnifying the silence into something almost oppressive. His eyes adjusted slowly, picking out shapes in the gloom, stacks of abandoned pallets, a rusted forklift sitting idle in the corner, coils of rope scattered on the concrete floor. Somewhere in the distance, a faint metallic clink broke the stillness, followed by a muffled sound that made his chest tighten. He moved toward it, every muscle in his body coiled and ready, the duffel bag heavy in his grip. A figure emerged from the shadows before he reached the center of the room. Tall, lean, with a predatory stillness that made the air feel colder, the man stepped into the spill of light from a single bulb hanging above. His face was older than Alexander remembered but unmistakable, his former associate, the one who had been closer to him than most family until greed and betrayal had severed the tie. The man's smile was thin and humorless as he greeted Alexander like an old friend, his voice smooth and mocking, savoring the moment. He gestured casually to the corner, and Alexander's gaze followed, landing on two small figures huddled together on the floor. The boys sat with their backs against the wall, their wrists bound with zip ties, their knees drawn close to their chests. Their wide, terrified eyes locked on him the instant they saw him, and the fear in them shifted into something desperate, a spark of hope that made his heart clench. He wanted to run to them, to tear through the restraints and carry them out of this place, but the man stepped in front of him, blocking the way with a deliberate slowness that was almost taunting. The kidnapper began to talk, weaving a bitter monologue about how Alexander had built his empire on other people's sacrifices, how he had taken everything and left nothing in return. This, he claimed, was justice, the kind of loss that would cut deeper than any business defeat. Alexander let him speak, his focus fixed on the boys behind him, scanning the room for any opening. He set the duffel bag down with a solid thud on the concrete, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. The man glanced at it, his attention flickering just long enough for Alexander to take a step forward. The kidnapper recovered quickly, his hand disappearing into his coat before pulling out a gun, the barrel rising with deliberate precision. For a moment, the air felt razor thin, the only sounds the creak of the floor under their feet and the shallow breaths of the boys in the corner. In that instant, Alexander moved. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and forcing the gun toward the ground as it fired, the shot cracking through the warehouse like thunder. The echo hadn't even faded before they were struggling, each trying to overpower the other. The man was wiry but strong, fueled by rage, his elbow driving hard into Alexander's side. Pain flared white-hot, but Alexander didn't let go. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him back into a stack of wooden pallets that groaned under the impact. The gun clattered to the floor and skidded out of reach, but the fight didn't stop. The kidnapper pulled a knife from somewhere behind his back, the blade flashing in the dim light. Alexander caught his wrist, twisting with every ounce of strength he had, but the blade nicked his side in a hot, slicing pain that made him grit his teeth. Blood began to spread under his shirt, but the injury only sharpened his focus. With a surge born from the image of his son still bound and watching, he wrenched the knife free and sent it clattering across the floor. He drove the man to the ground, pinning him there with his forearm pressed hard against his chest. Breathing hard, Alexander kept him down long enough to be sure he wasn't getting up, then pushed away and crossed the space to the boys. His hands shook as he pulled at the zip ties, cursing under his breath when they refused to snap until he found a shard of metal nearby to saw them open. The moment they were free, the boys threw their arms around him, their small bodies trembling against his. He pulled them in tight, burying his face in their hair for the briefest second before forcing himself to move. This wasn't over yet. From somewhere outside came the faint wail of sirens, growing louder by the second. Emily must have called in the police despite the warning, or one of his contacts had tipped them off. The boys clung to him as he guided them toward the door, glancing back just once to see the kidnapper still sprawled on the floor, glaring up at him with hatred but making no move to follow. The red and blue lights flashed against the metal walls as he stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting his face like a jolt back into reality. Paramedics rushed toward him, their hands moving quickly to check his wound, but Alexander refused to let go of the boys. Even as they worked, he kept his arms around them, feeling their shaky breaths begin to steady. In that moment, the pain in his side, the exhaustion in his limbs, the chaos of the last few hours, none of it mattered. All that mattered was that they were safe, and they were with him. As the police took the man away in handcuffs, Alexander knew one thing with unshakable certainty: he would never again let anyone or anything come between him and his sons. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing Alexander became aware of when consciousness returned. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the hospital room, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee drifting in from somewhere beyond the half-open door. His body felt heavy, each breath drawing a dull ache from the bandaged wound at his side, but the pain was softened by the warmth pressed against his arm. He turned his head and found Emily sitting beside him, her hair falling loosely over one shoulder, her brown eyes fixed on him not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted relief. She didn't speak right away, and for a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if they were both taking in the fact that this was real, that they were here, alive, with the boys safe somewhere nearby. When he followed her gaze toward the small couch against the wall, his chest tightened. The twins were curled up together under a pale hospital blanket, their faces soft in sleep, the faint rise and fall of their chests proof enough that the nightmare was over. They looked smaller like this, fragile in a way that made him want to shield them from everything beyond the walls of this room. The sight brought with it a rush of emotions, relief so sharp it bordered on pain, a deep gratitude that they were unharmed, and a guilt that no amount of rescue could fully erase. He had been given a second chance, and he knew chances like that didn't come twice. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around his hand, grounding him. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady, as though she had been holding on to these words since the moment they found the boys. She told him that what he had done, going into that warehouse alone, facing the danger head-on, had not gone unnoticed. She wasn't calling him a hero, she said, because heroics could be a one-time act, a burst of courage that faded with time. This was about something deeper. It was about showing up when it mattered, about standing between their children and danger without hesitation. It was about proving that his presence was more than an apology. Alexander listened in silence, the weight of her words settling over him. He told her he couldn't undo the years he had missed, couldn't erase the mistakes that had led them here, but he could choose every day from now on to be there, not in pieces, not in passing, but fully. He said it without the polished certainty of a man making a promise to close a deal, but with the quiet determination of someone who finally understood what was worth keeping. She studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the man who had once walked away. Whatever she saw seemed to ease something in her, and she gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness in full, not yet, but it was a doorway opening where there had once been a locked wall. When the boys stirred awake, their small bodies shifting under the blanket, they blinked at him sleepily before climbing onto the bed. They nestled carefully against his side, mindful of the bandages, their heads resting on his arm. He held them close, feeling the unfamiliar but welcome weight of them settling into a space that had been empty for far too long. Emily remained beside the bed, watching, her expression unreadable but no longer closed off. The moment felt fragile, like it could shatter with one wrong word, yet it also felt unshakable, anchored by something stronger than pride or fear. The hours passed slowly in the soft light of the hospital room. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals, offering quiet smiles when they saw the boys tucked against him. Outside the window, the city moved on in its usual rush, unaware that inside this small room, a life had shifted on its axis. Alexander realized that the wealth he had once measured in numbers and assets meant nothing compared to the warmth of his son's hands resting in his, or the sight of Emily sitting within arm's reach, no longer on the other side of a chasm he had created. As evening fell, Emily reached for his hand again, this time without hesitation. There was no speech, no need to fill the silence. The boys' breathing grew steady and deep as they drifted back to sleep, and Alexander looked at them, then at her, and knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. For the first time in years, the thought of the future didn't feel like an endless race toward something distant and hollow. It felt like a home he would fight to keep, a place he would never again walk away from. This ending works because it doesn't pretend that love and trust magically erase the past. Instead, it leaves us with a believable sense of hope that feels earned. Alexander's rescue of his sons is dramatic, but the real victory is quieter, choosing to stay, day after day, in the life he once abandoned. Emily's guarded acceptance feels authentic. It shows that forgiveness is a process, not a single moment. The story closes with the sense that their future will have challenges, but now he's a man who will meet them head-on. It's not a fairy tale, it's redemption grounded in reality, which makes it far more satisfying.